I'm Dr. John Gartner.
And I'm Dr. Harry Seagull.
And welcome to another session of Shrinking Trump.
John, this is episode number 56. We've been at this for a long time, really more than a year. And the show started because we were so concerned about Donald Trump's cognitive functioning and his severe personality disorder, which accounts for his grandiosity, his criminal behavior, as well as his really chronic lying, a compulsive lying, it seems. And John and I are both clinical psychologists. That's why we bring this particular expertise to this show. We do look at political issues and their impacts, but we try to do it from a psychological perspective. And this week, like all weeks, is another one filled with things, sadly, for us to talk about. Right, John?
Yeah. Well, and this week we're going to start with the top issue, which is the bombing of Iran. Segment I call Bomb Iran. But what I think people need to understand, if they don't know the background, is that we wouldn't be in this situation of Iran being so close to a nuclear weapon if Donald Trump hadn't done something that we virtually never do, or maybe have never done in American history, which is to tear up a treaty. You know, one of the things that people may not know about American history is when people make a deal with America, they don't think they've just made a deal with that president that can be undone in the next election. Part of the reason our treaties work is that people have been able to take to the bank. Other countries have been able to take to the bank. If they make a treaty with the United States, that every future president will honor it. It's a treaty with the United States. It's not a treaty with a particular president. And that's part of the reason that some countries are willing to make big concessions, because they're trusting the terms of the treaty that we have laid down. So when Donald Trump tore up, I just want people to understand two things about his tearing up that treaty. First, and most importantly, it has literally created the crisis that we are in now. But secondly, it also tears apart the fabric of American credibility more generally. Who in the heck is ever going to want to make a deal with the United States if we can just go, backsies, only kidding, right? Then why would you put your country at risk and give up your armaments or some other major concession if you can't trust the credibility of the United States of America? So for those people who may not know about the background of the Iranian nuclear deal, we have a little tutorial.
The depressing story of Lil Donnie being 100% responsible for the situation in Iran. Donnie is a narcissist. We all know this. His own supporters admit it. And it drives his every motive. He sees himself as the best negotiator who ever negotiated anything ever. So when the single greatest peace talk in world history was done not by him, but by Obama, a man who he loathes with every fiber of his being, Donnie lost his little mind. Let's follow the dominoes. Donnie was humiliated when a simple little joke was made about him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. At that moment, he decided anything Obama does must be undone. So he runs for president, he wins, and the very first thing he does is destroy the Iranian peace talk deal. A deal that would have seen the complete end of Iran's nuclear program in exchange for slowly welcoming them back to the world stage. It was a masterful bit of negotiation that would have, if not for Donnie, changed the shape of the planet. Everyone was in favor of it, every single person except for Donnie. Does Donnie replace it with anything? Does he open up negotiations? Does he do anything at all? Nope. The entire world condemned us for this move, and they were right. Iran instantly went back to work on their nuclear program, thanks to Donnie. Israel, fearful of an enemy on their doorstep with a nuclear weapon, began plans for an eventual invasion, thanks to Donnie. And now, we're about to enter a war, thanks to Donnie, while he screams that everyone needs to flee Tehran to avoid the consequences of Donnie's actions. Every single lost life is on his hands, because the baby we put in charge can't take a fucking joke.
So that's how we got here. We had the problem solved. It was broke, and it wasn't broke, and he fixed it. And now we've put ourselves in a position where Israel has warned for decades, basically, they will not. I mean, they have really set, I think, what is a rational and reasonable limit. They've said, if a country next door to us has made it our destruction, the core of their foreign policy and their belief system, okay, that our annihilation is their mission, okay, and it's not just in words, okay. Don't forget that Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, the three terrible H's, are all Iranian proxies. So they have been fighting a war with Israel for decades through these proxies. Obviously, it's blown up very recently with the October attacks and with the Israeli response, which obviously there's very strong feelings about that. The feelings run the gamut in my family. I have a daughter that was, protesting on campus, and I have relatives in swing states that changed their vote to Trump after the October 6th attacks and how they saw the response that the attacks received. So there's a lot we could argue about, but one thing is clear: the Israelis were going to set that limit. So now that the peace deal is off, it put us back in a position where the Israelis were going to do what they said they were going to do. Now, Trump, we've talked about this. Would he get us into a war? Right? You and I have kind of debated this, and I think it's actually a really important debate. We could even debate whether this is a war or whether it's just a military action that could lead to a war. But still, I think we need to recognize that Trump's ego is such that even though he doesn't want his voters to be upset that he's getting into war, historically speaking, can we even think of a malignant narcissist who's led a country who didn't get into a war? I would argue it's in their nature, regardless of its popularity, that they have this need to dominate and destroy and gain a sense of power and pleasure from that. So I think here, this was almost irresistible to Trump for several reasons. Number one, as you've pointed out, Harry, he wants to be the peacemaker, right? He has this fantasy that, Obama got a Nobel Prize, so he's going to get a Nobel Prize because he's going to be the one who ends this thing. But also, the other thing that made him feel so powerful is, in fact, America really was the only country in the world that had the bunker buster bombs. So, in fact, Iran's nuclear program actually couldn't be militarily taken out except by the United States. So it was almost irresistible to him, because then he could personally claim to have taken out Iran's nuclear program. He can say, I took out Iran's nuclear program, and I'm the one that got these two lunkheads to bump their heads together and make peace. So that's the fantasy that he has, right? That's what he wants to happen. However, of course, it didn't go exactly that way.
Let me just add a few things to what John just said. And it's true that the politics about the Israeli response to October 11th really runs the gamut. I was horrified by what Hamas did to the Israeli people and families and children. I've also been horrified at the kind of response in Gaza that Israel has given to the Palestinians. But I am a supporter of Israel and its right to exist, and so I may not approve of what's going on in Palestine, but I certainly understand the response to defend itself and also to go after any enemies who are declaring the death of Israel to be their objective, and that's been true of Iran since 1979.
Exactly.
And it's horrific. And the country living under this threat its entire life, right, as a nation, is horrifying, and it leads to all kinds of trauma responses, it seems to me. But in this case, the one thing I disagree with our little primer that we showed is that actually Israel was against the Iran deal. They were Netanyahu was against what Obama was doing. He was against Obama. But it's also true that I think a very effective deal It kicked things way down the road. It might have led to integrating Iran, but in any case, Trump destroyed the deal. Biden didn't try or wasn't successful in reinstating it. He made some weak gestures towards it, and then Israel attacked the proxy states of Iran and wiped them all out, and then wiped out Iran's air defense. So suddenly Israel was faced with Iran for the first time undefended, and they told Trump, let's go after the nuclear thing, right? And what Trump did was, no, I want to have peace. He wanted to be the peacemaker between the two of them. But at a certain point, the Israelis said, we're not waiting. And then they did what they could. And then they looked at Trump and said, please finish the job. So they put him in a weak position where if Trump didn't use the bunker busters, Trump would be looking weak. They did a Trump on Trump.
They manipulated him very effectively because he would look weak if he didn't do it, but also it was irresistible at how strong he would look if he did it. He'd be the guy with the big bunker buster bombs, right, who took out Iran's nuclear program, and he could actually rightfully take personal credit.
And in fact, after Israel took out more defenses and more people in Iran before the bunker busting bombs, Trump said, we have control of the skies of Iran. So it became we. He appropriated the power that Israel, the powerful position Israel was in, but Israel was manipulating him to do their bidding because they couldn't do it themselves. They didn't have the bombs. That's sort of where we were. And I really think it's important for us in analyzing Trump's psychopathology to look at what I call the psychopathology of grandiosity. The grandiosity, he's pumping himself up. Now it's, we're the ones who did it. We have control over the skies. And then Iran and Israel weren't getting together for a deal. Like it wasn't really happening. And then Trump orders the bombing. And then afterwards, he wants credit for having a ceasefire because then he can get the Nobel Prize. And look, guess what? They're not really cooperating, right?
Yeah, right. They're interfering with his grandiose fantasy, because his grandiose fantasy is that they're going to call him up to the podium in Stockholm because of the great peace he made. But the warring parties aren't cooperating with his narcissistic fantasy.
Exactly. And look at his response.
I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because the one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Man, is he mad?
He's really pissed. Yeah.
He's also frustrated. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, he's frustrated. You know, also just to say something about the use of the word fuck. Okay. Now, I'm the last person to throw stones, okay, here, because, you know, you and I grew up in New York City where fuck is a frequently used vocabulary word. If you looked it up in the New York City dictionary, it's got about 9 different meanings.
Well, John, do you know how they recite the alphabet in Brooklyn?
No. How?
Fucking A, fucking B, fucking C.
Well, there you go. And I'm from Brooklyn. So and I can tell you, I've been fighting this war for 30 years. I've been living in Maryland for 30 years, and I still keep asserting my right to use the word fuck, despite the fact that people like shocked, like, oh my God, the F bomb, you know, like, I'm sorry, it's not a bomb, it's a word. Um, so I usually say I'm the last person to be, casting stones about the use of the word fuck. But I'm also not president of the United States, and I would never have been qualified to run for or win the office of president of the United States, in part because I'm the kind of person that does things like that and says things like that. But it's not presidential. And obviously, he's broken every other norm. Why would this one matter? But as you've pointed out, one of the things that happens with dementia is that people lose control over their verbiage in a way where they start using obscenities more frequently or inappropriately. It's a small point, but I just want to point it out that the norms keep changing so often. Just want to point out presidents didn't used to say fuck. That's all.
I do think this is the first time.
Yeah.
Like ever.
Yeah.
It's funny, if you don't follow the news or you don't listen to his pathology and you're just kind of tuning in, he seems like a tough guy. Like he's scolding them. It's kind of effective if you don't know the context. Which is, unfortunately, he and his cronies, they're sometimes more effective if you don't really pay attention. They seem to be really striking the pose. It's not that they're making good points. We'll see this later with Pam Bondi. Yeah. But they're effective in seeming strong. And in this case, I thought, wow, well, there he is. He's scolding these two guys. Now, I want to go back and look at this whole issue over obliterated. If you guys don't know the sequence of this, after the bombing, Trump, Hegseth, and Caroline Leavitt all came out and said that Iran's nuclear program was obliterated. Literally, that word, obliterated. A couple of days ago, the Defense Intelligence Assessment, a report was leaked saying that actually they didn't obliterate the reactors, that it really put back Iran's nuclear program for maybe 2 to 6 months. And the Trump administration went into attack mode. They referred to the person who did this as a loser, as someone out to hurt the president. They went after CNN and Natasha Bertrand, one of the best reporters out there. If anyone follows international reporting, Natasha's the best. And CNN, by the way, to their credit, said, like fun, we're going to fire her. Anyway, here's the group talking about obliteration.
Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
Completely and totally obliterated. We're going to really be working on that one word, obliterated, right? And of course,
yes.
Go ahead. Where did I say?
No.
Of course, these talking monkeys are going to keep reinstating that word, right? They're going to keep emphasizing the word obliterated in obedience to their furor.
And the beginning of that, he says nuclear enrichment.
That's right. There was a little mini paraphasia there, just under the radar. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
All right, here comes P.D. Hegseth.
Thanks to President Trump's bold and visionary leadership and his commitment to peace through strength, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated.
Boy, does he need
that word?
Hate him. Yeah, there it is. And then finally, really, the hateful Caroline Leavitt.
And just to follow up for clarity, you said, yes, it was completely and totally obliterated, because there have been different assessments on exactly how much damage has been done.
We are confident, yes, that Iran's nuclear sites were completely and totally obliterated, as the president said in his address to the nation on Saturday night.
But here's the problem, of course. It wasn't, okay? And that just goes back, and it should have been, right? You know, it's like if you take a shot at the king, you must not miss. I mean, if you're going to take this radical action, right, and make a military attack on Iran to try to obliterate their nuclear program, you need to obliterate it. Okay. So it just comes back to what we have always said. Look, the Trump administration isn't just evil. They're also stupid.
And
they're
by the
really
way,
incompetent.
And you know who confirmed the report of the DIA?
The Israelis.
Israel. Right. They said, oh, yeah. And you know what that means, John? It's not going to be a ceasefire.
Because they're not going to let it go.
No.
And here's the thing. Because they're so performative, right? They didn't, and they have the bunker buster bombs, right? But they didn't take it from point A to point B. It's like, maybe you should have made 2 bombing runs or 3 bombing runs. Like, finish the job. Don't just drop a few bombs and then say mission accomplished, right? Because it's not. As it turns out, actually, they loaded up like 16 trucks and they were taking what might be enriched uranium out of that basement area. So something like they crushed part of the lab and a couple of the doors, but they were still able to get all the goods out the door that wasn't crushed.
No, the days before, the Iranians put the material on 16 trucks.
Oh,
and the Israelis before, and Israel knew about it. It's just extraordinary. John's right. They're not just awful, evil. They're also incompetent. They're incompetent.
And so
I'm sorry. And then they attack the press. And they say that you're not respecting the bravery of the pilots, like anyone is attacking the pilots.
Right. So here we have the press reporting on the oops, we didn't get it all. Trump reiterates claims about Iran's nuclear program that contradicts early intelligence findings. President Trump pushed back Wednesday on the findings of a preliminary classified U.S. report, insisting again that Iran's nuclear program was obliterated, despite the early intelligence suggesting U.S. strikes had just set the program back only by a few months. The Trump administration has rebuked the media for reporting on that early assessment from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, which officials said found that U.S. strikes had sealed off entrances to 2 of the 3 nuclear sites, but not collapsed their underground buildings. When pressed on Wednesday at the NATO summit in the Netherlands about whether the intelligence report was incorrect, Mr. Trump, who has often questioned the findings of America's own intelligence agencies, said it was, quote, very inconclusive, and that the officials at the agency, quote, really don't know. There was no reason to worry about Iran rebuilding its nuclear program, he said, reiterating his claims about obliteration. So this is the gang that can't even bomb straight. And then he had to go to NATO, right? And so it gets worse. So at NATO, he's trying to bullshit all the other NATO countries into believing we've obliterated the program, and it's not working. By the end of his trip to the Netherlands, Mr. Trump seemed as focused on proving he has obliterated Iran's sites as he once was on proving that he had the largest inauguration crowd. I love that line from the Times. As part of his efforts to counter the preliminary intelligence report from the Pentagon, Mr. Trump, during his news conference, read part of a statement from the Israel Atomic Energy Commission. I don't actually have that quote here, but he actually, just so you know, he misquoted the quote. They said partially destroyed. He changed it to totally obliterated. So he actually misquoted their report. Administration officials also denied that Iran had moved its stockpile of 880 pounds of near bomb-grade fuel from storage areas in the ancient city of Isfahan and at other plants in Iran. Some American intelligence officials say they believed it was moved. And Rafael Mariano Grossi, the Secretary General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, part of the United Nations, said Iranian officials had told him the stockpile was going to be moved to avoid threats from Mr. Trump. On Wednesday, he said he did not know about its whereabouts. So he's selling this like he's selling the lie about his crowd size, is what the Times is saying. I think there's a very sort of good little tongue-in-cheek barb there.
Oh, it's the way he sold that he won the 2020 election.
Right, right.
It's like all of his lies.
It's like all of his lies. You know, if he says it, it's true, right? So just like he kept saying he won the election, or he had the biggest crowd size, I'm sure he's going to say over and over again that he obliterated Iran's nuclear program. And unfortunately, that will play on Fox News. That will be the story. People will believe it. And it will make him look strong.
And look, but I want to go back to this very briefly, this notion of pathological grandiosity. That is, Trump has to experience himself as great. He has to proclaim it. He has to be praised. He has to be getting this supply of adulation all the time. And if he doesn't, he's going to collapse. That's how narcissistic personality disorders are structured. And it's unfortunate because it doesn't allow him to be measured. I mean, all they had to do was say, we have a very significant strike. We believe that the nuclear program was severely damaged. We're going to wait and see what the intelligence reports say. And if it's not damaged enough, we'll go back. That's all they had to say. And really, it's very clear they damaged the facilities a great deal.
Sure.
That's all they had to say. But now look at this self-imposed wound.
So, of course, Trump is enraged, right? That the press is not accepting his lie, that he totally obliterated the program. So he does what Trump does, which is he goes on the attack. But listen to how angry he is at the press. You can tell this really stings.
We have scum that's in this group, and not all of you are. You have some great reporters, but you have scum. CNN is scum. MSDNC is scum. The New York Times is scum. They're bad people. They're sick. And what they've done is they're trying to make this unbelievable victory into something less. Now,
they're scum. They're scum. They're sick. They're trying to make my great victory into something else because they read the intelligence report. They're scum.
John, I love it when you make fun of Trump, but I don't know. It's chilling that he would say something like that. It's so direct. It's so vile. It's so, you call people scum and bad and sick people. He's been doing this for years. I never can get used to it. I never get used to it. It always offends me each time.
Well, we shouldn't get used to it. I'm glad you're offended.
And you know, Jake Tapper had a fantastic response on CNN. He took 5 minutes out of his show to talk about the patriotism of reporters who ask hard questions. That getting the information is the responsibility of a free society. It was a wonderful bit that he gave, and I was really glad to hear him do it.
Yeah. Anything that causes Trump any narcissistic injury, right? We understand this, means that person is evil, right? If you make me feel less than perfect about myself, you are evil and you should be punished. It's such a reflexive response that it has nothing to do with reality. Obviously, in fact, what they're being punished for is hewing to reality.
Exactly. Call someone scum. I mean, as if they're just filth.
Right.
You know, there's a Nazi kind of feel to that, isn't there?
Right. Yeah. Right. So because scum is, deserving to be destroyed.
No, it's not even anything. It's just filth.
Subhuman. It's filth. Right.
It's like calling the Jews vermin. It's like that. If he called the press vermin, I wouldn't be surprised.
No,
it's the same
and their crime is telling the truth. So in Trump's America, telling the truth is a crime, worthy of severe punishment. So I just wanted to give a few clips from his performance at NATO for a few different reasons. First, I wanted to start with he starts talking about Hegseth, who's the Secretary of Defense, and calling him the Secretary of War, which used to be what the position was called back in Lincoln's day. But that in of itself wouldn't be such a big deal. But it's showing us something about his psychology. He starts out the press conference so pumped up. He's like beating his chest. Whoa, we call it the Department of War because we feel like warriors. Whoa! So let's hear that.
Rubio with me and Pete Hegseth, Secretary
of State and Secretary of War. Should we say Secretary? You know, it used to be called Secretary of War. Maybe for a couple of weeks we'll call it that because we feel like warriors. It used to be called Secretary of War. In fact, if you look at the old building next to the White House, you can see where it used to be Secretary of War. Then we became politically correct, and they called it Secretary of Defense. I don't know, maybe we'll have to start thinking about changing it, but we feel that way. Do we have any questions?
I had the thought, so let's do it. Politically correct. Politically correct.
Right.
Like it happened last week.
You know, those DEI people, those are the ones, they're the guys that took the letters off the building. That just happened last week, apparently.
100 something years ago.
Right,
All right.
Exactly. Politically correct people from the 1870s. Now here's where you see him a little bit on his back heel, right? Because he's being confronted at the NATO press conference about the lack of obliteration. And you can see how he kind of sidesteps and then finally, of course, asserts that it is a total obliteration.
Reaction to the intelligence reports saying that the Iranian nuclear sites were only partially devastated, not entirely.
Yeah, well, they said it was actually, the report said it could have been very, they don't know. I mean, they did a report. I could have Pete talk to it because his department did the report. They really don't know. I think Israel's going to be telling us very soon because Bibi is going to have people involved in that whole situation. We hear it was obliteration. It was a virtual obliteration. When you take a look at the ground above, don't forget the flame is all underground. But everything above, if you look at the before and the after picture, everything above is burned black. The trees, everything. There's one building, but that's a building that sunk substantially into the granite, so that, you know, the fire goes right over it. It was, I believe it was total obliteration. I believe they didn't have a chance to get anything out because we acted fast. If it would have taken 2 weeks, maybe, but it's very hard to remove that kind of material. Very hard and very dangerous for them to remove it. Plus, they knew we were coming, and if they know we're coming, they're not going to be down there. There aren't too many people that are going to be down there.
13 trucks. 13 trucks 2 days earlier. Thank you. God,
no, but Harry, they're not going to be down there. But if they know we're coming, they're not going to be down there. If they know we're coming, if they know we're coming, of course they're going to be down there. They're going to be getting their stuff out. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. None of it makes any sense. Like, look, all you have to look at the pictures. Everything's black. Everything's black in the picture. Okay. How do I know what's happening at the base of the mountain based on everything being black in the picture? Well, the fire's all underground. So now we're creating this fantasy. It's all burning under there. I don't know what's happening. Do we know that it's burning? It's just made up. But it's just him asserting his grandiose fantasy against the reality that that the allies know about, that the intelligence reports know about, that everybody knows about. But the people on Fox News, they're going to believe it was obliterated. The last clip I wanted to show from this is actually sounds crazier than it is. So I want to actually give a little context because, I don't want to be trying to quote things out of context to make him look crazier than he is. He starts talking about icebreakers, and people are really confused about what he's talking about. Some people thought he was talking about icebreakers for peace talks in Iran, with Ukraine. It was a little bit confusing. It turns out he played golf with the president of Finland and mentioned something about our buying some actual boats, icebreaking boats. But here's what I want to point out about cognitive decline. At first it sounded crazy, like he was talking about conversational icebreakers, then he was talking about actual boats. So it seemed like a complete free association. It wasn't. He was talking about boats. But when people have dementia, they can sometimes fixate on really irrelevant details, right? And get into a whole complicated description of an irrelevant sort of detail and kind of miss the big picture. So here he is, in front of NATO, talking about these big issues, Ukraine, bombing Iran. And he gets sidetracked on this discussion of icebreakers.
Icebreakers. You're very good at icebreakers. And I actually made him an offer. I didn't go to Congress. They'll try and impeach me for this. But there's an old, it's not old, it's fairly new, but it's used icebreaker. And I offered him
about 1/3 of what he asked for. But we're negotiating. We need icebreakers in the U.S., and if we can get some inexpensively, I'd like to do that. Actually, they'll fix it up, make it good. Also, we may buy some icebreakers. You know, you're the king of icebreakers, that particular country. They make them good. They make them really good, and they know what they're doing. And so we're negotiating with them for about 15 different icebreakers, but one of them is available now. It's old, and it's, old. It's like 5-6 years old. Now we're trying to buy it. I'm trying to make a good deal. All I do my whole life. My whole life, that's all I do is make deals. Yeah, please.
Notice he's talking to a Finnish reporter after having spent the day with the president of Finland. He goes, yeah, that particular country makes good icebreakers. So he can't even remember the name of the country. He says that country, they make the icebreakers. They're really good ones. And, we're going to buy them and we need some. And I made a good deal. I offered them only a little bit of money because I'm a deal maker, but we're going to get those ice. It's like, who cares about icebreakers? This is like such an irrelevant detail.
And that's your point, John. It's not that he's crazy and bringing up something that he didn't actually talk about earlier that day. He doesn't know the importance to give to it. He doesn't, say, well, I had a wonderful meeting with the prime minister. We did talk about, we'd like to buy some of their ice-breaking ships because it helps us clear the North Sea, in certain ways, or to clear the North Atlantic, rather, of ice. It just goes off, and then it's about how he loves to make deals and how he offered this and he might be impeached. And there's no order. I guess he used to call this the weave.
Right.
It's got that weave feeling to it, which means that he's just associating in the neighborhood of what's appropriate, but not really regulating it, not really organizing what he's saying, which is what professional politicians do, actually.
Right. I mean, that term, the weave, I have to say, was really kind of brilliant because it's really the opposite of what's happening. Everything is coming, his thought is coming unraveled. And then he's trying to find the little pieces of string and find some way to patch them together in whatever hodgepodge way he can do. That's why when they asked him a question about Harvard, he starts talking about Harlem. But he didn't just misunderstand the word, right? Because then he says, and the people in Harlem, they're very in favor of what we're doing in Harvard. It's like, whoa, so he's bringing it back to Harvard after having meandered off on a loose association to the word Harlem. So that's not a weave, or you could say it is a weave. It's the way people with dementia confabulate, right? They have this thought, reminds them of that thought, then they remember what they're supposed to be talking about, and they try to put it together in some way. It doesn't work, but it's an attempt. It's an attempt to have a cohesive thought or to stay on topic, but really they've lost the thread. Yeah,
no, it's an attempt to weave, right? It isn't the weave. It's an attempt to respond to the unraveling.
Good point. That's a good point.
Yeah. No, it's awful, isn't it?
One of the things we've talked. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and he's in charge of the country.
Yeah, right. And one of the things we've talked about is how few politicians are commenting on his cognitive decline. One of the politicians who has been on this issue from the very beginning is our friend Jamie Raskin. He was elected for the first time at the same time Trump was, and one of his first actions was to try to create a law that would flesh out the phrase in the Constitution. According to the 25th Amendment, Congress is supposed to set up a body to evaluate the president should he need to be evaluated. And he pointed out that law had never been established. So that was H.R. 186. And this is how we met Jamie Raskin. So because duty to warn was born at the same time as he was elected. And so he'd only been in office a few months, and he proposed this, and we had him come and give a speech for duty to warn in Washington. And he's helped us in other ways. But here he is talking to David Pakman. Now, David Pakman is also a friend of ours. We have been on his show a number of times. And as you and I like to point out, every time we're on his show, he gets 1 million views, which he monetizes. We don't. But it shows the interest in this topic. And actually, I want to thank David because he has taken this topic and really made it his own. He's talking about Trump's cognitive decline in almost every show now. But here he is interviewing Jamie Raskin.
Have any of your colleagues on the Republican side intimated to you that they also suspect something may be going on with the president that is more than just he's a little excited. In other words, all of these questions that the corporate media doesn't seem to want to ask about
Not
the
a
president.
word from any of them. I mean, some of them do have questions about war powers.
Okay.
So, you know, some of them are willing, at least behind the scenes, to have a rational discussion about what's taking place. But on that, no. In fact, they keep talking about Joe Biden. Right. And I think that the obsession with Joe Biden's geriatric health is a complete projection of what is going on with Donald Trump now. Of course, you know, but nobody's talked about the 25th Amendment and the presidential incapacity or inability to meet the demands of his office. But what we see on TV is truly cause for some alarm.
I love the fact that he says it's a projection, which is a very psychologically sophisticated idea that we've been talking about for a long time. Jamie Raskin gets it.
He does. He's great.
Yeah, no, we love Jamie Raskin. All right, so I'm just going to end this sequence, narcissistically referring to myself.
And me too.
Back in during the first Trump administration, I was asked to edit a book about Trump and nuclear war, so I did with a co-author. It's called Rocket Man: Nuclear Madness and the Mind of Donald Trump, edited by John Gartner and Steve Buser. And you know, Harry, you and I keep debating this issue of, you know, is Trump a warmonger? Is Trump going to get us into a war? And you've taken the position that because it's so unpopular with his base and he loves his popularity, that's kind of our protection. Maybe our hope is, we hope it's our protection, you know, against his getting us into World War III. And yet I'm going to quote myself. But the reason I'm doing it is because this Iran thing, I think, really brings up this prospect again. And my point in the book, and the point that I'm going to make now, is the malignant narcissists historically have always started wars. Now, this quote is about nuclear war, it may not apply to nuclear war, it may apply to some kind of other attack that might lead to a larger war, but I still just wanted to read it to you. These four sources of Trump's mental deterioration, in the book, I talk about his malignant narcissism, his dementia, and also the stress that he's under. I forget what the fourth source was. Should send chills of terror up our spines. We are not in a static situation, but rather a deteriorating one. And as every day goes by, we are at greater risk of nuclear annihilation. Trump might push the button because, at a moment of crisis, he lacks the cognitive capacity to objectively and critically analyze the data. He might look, he will lose, he does not have the ability to look at a standoff from an adversary's point of view, since he appears to have no empathy even when he was cognitively intact, or to fashion a creative alternative to war. He might push the button because at times he appears to be in a true psychotic state, operating under the influence of grandiose and paranoid delusions, believing either that he is an invincible conqueror or that his adversary is imminently planning to attack when he is not. He might push the button because he is angry, impulsive, and determined to show the world who is boss by employing the ultimate power, as perverse as that sounds. Trump would revel in being the center of chaos and destruction. In a wag the dog scenario, he might push the button in a conscious, cynical calculation that while millions might die, war would distract from the Mueller investigation and rally his base behind him as commander-in-chief and consolidate his power. He might push the button because he is egged on to do so by his uber-hawk war cabinet, who may throw gasoline on Trump's fire when they should be throwing buckets of cold water. Most likely, if doom awaits us, it will be some combination of these factors, coming together in a perfect storm that will take us to DEFCON 1. In my opinion, Donald Trump is sick, and he is getting worse. As he goes further downhill, the risk of Armageddon skyrockets. The time to panic is now.
No, it's an excellent book, and people should read the first essay in it, written by yours truly.
Oh, I didn't even look for a quote from you.
John was nice enough to invite me to write the first essay, which I entitled "The Erratic President." So, if you like the kinds of stuff we talk about, and John's really written extensively on this stuff, I think you might like the book. It's I think it's informative and still relevant.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up, because, you know, a lot of people said to me, well, you said he was going to start a war in the first administration and he didn't. So that was one of your predictions that didn't come true. And I said, thank God. You know, I care more about the world being attacked than being right. I'm wrong about stuff all the time. But now that he's got a second bite at the apple, I think it's useful to go back and review some of those discussions that we were having about the danger of his lighting a match that would set the world on fire.
See, I think there's a danger of him lighting the match. I don't think there's a danger of him thoughtfully committing soldiers, boots on the ground. He will not do that to his base. He won't. And maybe let him.
Mistake. You know, a lot of times these wars get started by miscalculations.
I don't know. I take your point. I'm just saying he's not going to say, you know, it's time to rally the country. We need to send troops to Iran to support Israel. He's not going to do that.
Right.
Anyway.
I think you're right about that. I hope you're right about that. Yeah.
Wow.
All right. Well, so moving on from the international crisis in Iran, you and I were both absolutely heartsick and enraged by this latest Supreme Court decision. It's absolutely outrageous, right? That Trump is kidnapping immigrants and then, with no due process, sending them to hellholes in third countries, where they will be brutalized, tortured, enslaved, and probably killed. During the first Trump administration, when I first started comparing Trump to Hitler, which was very early in his administration, people are saying, oh, come on, you're exaggerating. It's not like he's going to start concentration camps. Well, one of the things I pointed out is actually it was his intention to start concentration camps. He built camps out in the desert to house 250,000 illegal immigrants that he was going to house there. It was actually when the child separation policy blew up and created so much opposition that he actually backed off on that. But of course, we see now he's, you know, raring to go again to do that. But one thing I did say is, look, concentration camps are not the same as death camps, right? The Japanese internment camps would be an example of a concentration camp, because the definition of a concentration camp is you're concentrating an undesirable population in a enclosed, incarcerated area, a camp. So even if you're not killing them, you're still incarcerating them. Well, you know, in fact, what he's doing here is outsourcing death camps. He's sending people to third countries, to camps and prisons in third countries, where they will be killed with no due process. So this is absolutely horrific. And the courts rightfully tried to stop him and said it is a fundamental, in fact, it's the most fundamental principle of jurisprudence. It doesn't just go back to the Constitution. It goes back to the Magna Carta, which, as last time I pointed out, I can't remember when the Magna Carta, I was always bad with dates at school. I can remember when the Magna Carta was. It turned out it was much earlier than I thought, it was like the 1200s. So we're talking about jurisprudence that's almost 1,000 years old, okay? And the fundamental principle is you can't just grab somebody and throw them in a hole without due process. Everybody deserves their day in court before the punishment is assessed and assigned. Okay, that is the fundamental legal right that every human being in Britain and then in America has had for almost 1,000 years.
And it applies to non-citizens. It's not just citizens.
It does.
Anybody in the country.
If you have a body, then habeas corpus applies to you. Okay. It doesn't just say American bodies, it's all bodies. Okay. Can't grab a body, okay, without due process. Okay. So
unless you're a celebrity and they let you do it.
That's true. We have to put that exception in there, don't we? Or I guess if the Supreme Court lets you do it. because what happened here is should have been an absolute no-brainer. This should have been a unanimous decision, right? That this is absolute to support the lower courts that were and the appeals courts that were saying, no, this is the line. This is the line. If you're going to have any rule of law, this is the line. And so what has the Supreme Court done? Supreme Court allows Trump to swiftly deport certain immigrants to third countries. The Trump administration sought to overturn a judge's ruling that imposed a legal process for deporting convicted criminals to places other than their countries of origin. In a brief, unsigned order, and we're going to talk more about this, I want you to look at these words, a brief, unsigned order that did not explain its reasoning. The court put on hold a federal judge's ruling that those affected nationwide should have a, quote, meaningful opportunity, end quote, to bring claims that they would be at risk of torture, persecution, or death if they were sent to countries the administration has made deals with to receive deported immigrants. Justice Sotomayor wrote in a dissenting opinion that the court had stepped in to, quote, grant the government emergency relief from an order it has repeatedly defied. She said the court was, quote, rewarding lawlessness by allowing the Trump administration to violate immigrants' due process rights. The fact that, quote, thousands will suffer violence in far-flung locales, end quote, is less important to the conservative majority than the, quote, remote possibility, end quote, that the judge had exceeded his authority, Sotomayor said. So this is so obscene. It is so obscene that they have tossed out the most fundamental right of due process in an unsigned order with no explanation. I mean, can you imagine? You're upending all of 1,000 years of jurisprudence, but there's no real need to explain it. There's no need to explain your reasoning.
They just put a hold on the federal judge's order. So how does that work, John? I have to ask some legal friends of mine, because does that mean it just stays like that? I mean, is there no decision? Are they going to come to a decision later? It's just,
well, it leaves open that there will be, since it's a stay, it doesn't mean that the issue is a hold. It doesn't mean that the issue has been completely settled. But in the meantime, thousands of people are going to be sent to their death.
Right. Which includes sending immigrants to Sudan or to these new gulags they're building in Florida that will be outside the federal penal system.
Yeah. And you wanted to talk about Harvard negotiating?
Oh, I just had an update because we had a wonderful guest last week from Harvard Medical School who was talking about the ways in which the Trump administration has literally decimated, federally funded research at major medical schools and universities. And a very uninformative article in the Times said that Harvard is quietly negotiating with the Trump administration, trying to find some common ground to get out of the mess that they're in, because the Trump administration has real leverage over them. But I don't have any more news than that.
Yeah. We're just sad to hear that is happening, because they have put up a very noble and notable resistance, and they have really been in the vanguard. So it's sad to hear that they might be quietly suing for peace, and I hope that won't happen.
Well, they have been winning in the courts, as far as
That's right.
Courts stopped the Trump administration from preventing them from admitting foreign students. So yeah. We'll see. I think we'll see. Well, we don't know.
I don't know. Well, Harry, you've brought in sequences just because you hate little Mikey Johnson so much
I do.
You just have to show his unctuousness. That was the word of the week last week. People really loved you're introducing the word unctuous, which is absolutely perfect for describing the oily, grimy,
the self-righteous little creep that he is.
Yes, absolutely. I have a particular loathing for Pam Bondi. And there are three. She was speaking before Congress today, and I wanted to show you these sequences because they're so repulsive. But not only does she not answer any of these very serious questions in a serious manner, she acts like a little mean girl from 11th grade. Okay. Attacking the questioner, changing the question, saying, "Oh, I guess it's about Biden, huh?" Changing to talking mean about Biden. So I just want you to see how disrespectful and also how off topic she is. But as you've pointed out, Harry, maybe in some ways effectively. So here she is. So there's three different sections I want to show you. One is a congressman is asking her about people who have been pardoned for January 6th. Are they immune from any further crimes that they might commit?
In addition to my role here, the committee that I serve on as an authorizer oversees Capitol security as well as federal elections. So I'm closely following the aftermath of January 6th. Recently, several defendants who received presidential pardons related to that day are now arguing in court that the pardon covers crimes like, for instance, illegal firearm possession discovered in a search of an individual's home in California months after January 6th. What's your position on whether the pardons cover these separate offenses?
The pardon power rests with the president, not the Department of Justice, and some of that is pending litigation, and I cannot discuss pending litigation.
Well, I'm not asking you about who has the right to a pardon. I think as the Department of Justice in February wrote, the pardon is an act of grace which removes the punishment from a crime a person has committed. It further said, in its effect, the granting of a pardon is in no sense the overturning of a judgment of conviction. It is an executive action that mitigates or sets aside punishment. So as the chief law enforcement officer, what's your opinion, not the president's power of whether he can offer a pardon? That's pretty clear in the Constitution. But for crimes committed unrelated to January 6th, would you suggest that the pardons would cover activities or crimes potentially committed outside of that by the same person?
Well, I don't know if you're referring to Joe Biden pardoning his son after he said he would not pardon Hunter Biden, or the
no, I actually referred to
of all
January
the
6th. I'm sorry.
all the sentences that the people that were on death row. I've met with those families.
No,
all of those sentences were commuted. I'm not going to comment on pardons on either side of the aisle.
So, well, I'm not asking about either side. I'm asking, you're the chief law enforcement officer in the United States. You have a responsibility directly, but you swore an oath to the Constitution, not the president. Want to know what your views are on the extent to which pardons cover potential crimes committed by individuals who have been pardoned but unrelated to January 6th.
Do you mean the ones that were done by the auto pen? I'm not going to discuss anything that
Mr.
could
Chairman,
be or not be
I
pending litigation.
respectfully, Ms. DeLauro accused you of filibustering. I think that's the height of filibustering. This is a serious, serious topic. And for you to suggest that you don't have an opinion or to divert to other things that had nothing to do with January 6th pardons, I think is frankly demeaning to your responsibilities and your job. With that, I'll yield back.
It's really a very simple question, and the obvious answer is no. If you've been pardoned for crimes related to January 6th, it doesn't mean that you have immunity from all future crimes. It's not a license to crime. It's a really simple question. It's a very simple question. But instead, she acts like a little bitch. She goes, "Oh, you're talking about Joe Biden pardoning Hunter?" No, we're not talking about Joe Biden pardoning his son. Absolutely has nothing to do with that.
No, she's stonewalling and going on the attack.
Right.
That's all. And she's doing it rather effectively.
That's the thing that's sort of scary. Yeah. And so this is what I mean about how Trump's DNA has really now spread, right, to infect his whole cabinet, the whole party, right? Because this used to be very Trumpian, right? So you would ask him a question like, well, are you guilty of A? He goes, those bad people, they're the ones that are guilty of A. You should get them. But now the Attorney General is doing it. And it's just a straightforward question, right? Are they immune to future crimes? It's a simple yes or no question. The answer is obviously no. It's an easy question. But instead, it's like, oh, we're going to talk about Joe Biden and his auto pen and all the, I met with all the people on death row who he pardoned and their families and how the families of the victims and how upset they were. It's like, this has nothing to do with what we are talking about. It's just a reflexive attack.
John, you don't answer questions. You attack. You just attack. And it's he chose her for this reason. And
I know
she's performing for him. She
really is.
They all perform, and she speaks about him in his presence as if he's a deity. Remember that cabinet meeting where she just said, you're just so amazing that I get to work
greatest president in history, the greatest.
Oh no, she's really a piece of work.
She's really a piece of work. Now, here she is being asked a very simple question about why she didn't disclose that she worked as a foreign agent for Qatar.
Attorney General, have you ever been registered as an agent of a foreign principal under the Foreign Agents Registration Act?
I assume you're talking about when I represented the country of Qatar for a very short time. Hold on. No. For anti-human trafficking for the World Cup. Anti-human trafficking for the World Cup.
Attorney
you can't
General,
put words in my mouth.
No.
You want to talk about incompetence? You're the one that said Joe Biden on PBS was competent. You had to retract those words.
Mr.
Don't
Chairman,
talk to me. Don't insult me publicly.
This is so discourteous. This is so outside the committee's guidelines. Taking a personal shot at me while swiping at Biden, very strange and very unprofessional of you. The answer is yes or no, and the answer is yes. You were registered as a lobbyist for Qatar. Is that correct? Yes. Never mind. Don't answer. Did you disclose that when you went before for the Senate for confirmation? Yes or no? No, it was not in your documents. The answer is no. President Trump.
This was discussed at my confirmation hearings in detail.
It was discussed, but you failed to bring up the conflict that you had. President Trump recently announced he'd accept that $400 million Qatar airplane because it was just prettier than the one he was flying around in. Is it true that you gave advice that this was legally permissible? Yes or no?
I will not discuss any advice that my Office of Legal Counsel gives to the President of the United States on any matter.
When you spoke before the Senate, you said you would ask for ethical advice. Did you recuse yourself from that issue?
And talking about unprofessional, you say the president wanted a jet because it's pretty?
Excuse me.
This is a Senate. This is a
He said it
congressional
himself.
hearing.
He said it himself.
Again, just don't answer the question. Just attack in an incredibly discourteous and sort of just childish, chiding kind of way.
I don't think it's childish. I think it's aggressive and effective. She looks like she's pushing back. She looks strong. I think she's despicable. I think this congresswoman caught her in a lie.
Right.
So I'm not taking her side. I'm just trying to evaluate what she's doing. She scares me. She's too good at this.
Pam Bondi scares me a lot because she is too good at it. And Harry, what I'm worried about is flash forward to when she's in congressional hearings, explain why she has, disallowed the election. Right? It's like sound very reasonable and, don't answer the questions and make ad hominem attacks because, when she's trying to invalidate an election. She's the kind of person that will take it that extra step that Bill Barr wouldn't do. She's showing us that. She's showing us who she is. And we're seeing it we don't have to imagine going forward. Look, one of the biggest issues that is happening right now is that we are kind of regressing to a police state. I wanted to have a longer section about this, but we talked about it last week, so I have to kind of tight filter how often we touch each topic. But it's just outrageous. The number of things you can see on social media of these masked ICE agents just violating every rule in the book, just grabbing people off the street, tackling anyone they want, accosting anyone they want, and just breaking their windows, pulling them out of cars, demanding their ID. And when people are saying, and these are people with masks who don't even have any kind of uniform, might have ICE written on their chest or something, but most of what they're wearing is stuff you could buy in Walmart. Okay, so if a bunch of masked men, right, try to abduct you, you have a right to ask for their identification. And there is video after video after video of people saying, I need to see your identification. Can I please see your identification? You say you're a federal agent. Do you have a badge? Do you have a card? Do you have anything that lets me know you're not just a kidnapper, that you have authority, that I should obey you? And they just don't do it. They just keep getting more aggressive and more aggressive if you question them, right? And now they're even knocking down and arresting third parties that are questioning them when they're attacking another person. So there's a lot of this on social media, folks, if you want to see it. And we've shown it before, we'll show it again. But here's Pam Bondi answering questions about that.
So my question for you, Attorney General Bondi, is given the number of DOJ employees currently conducting immigration enforcement activities in support of DHS, how are you going to ensure that the safety of the public and the officers, if they continue to not follow required protocol to identify themselves as law enforcement?
And Senator Peters, that's the first time that issue has come to me about them you're saying that law enforcement officers, when they cover their faces.
Right.
I do know they are being doxxed, as you said. They're being threatened. Their families are being threatened. Again,
I get that. But they have to identify themselves. There is an insignia oftentimes. They have to identify themselves as law enforcement. People think, here's a person coming up to me, not identified, covering themselves. They're kidnapping. They'll probably fight back. That endangers the officer as well. And that's a serious situation. People need to know that they're dealing with a federal law enforcement official.
Senator, I would be happy to look at that issue with you and talk to all of our partner law enforcement agencies. But I can assure you that if they're covering their faces now, it's to protect themselves. But they also want to protect all citizens. And that's something we can work together on to ensure the safety of everyone and their families.
Yeah. And it's protecting themselves, too, if they identify themselves. It's not just the person, because someone's going to fight back if you just think a strange person with their face covered throwing you into a van. Most people will resist that.
It sounds like you have a specific case, and I would
be happy
to talk to you about that at a later time, because I'm not aware of that happening. But I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
We'd be happy to do it. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Sounds like you have a specific case in mind. A specific case. This is happening thousands of times across the country. If you watch TikTok, folks, watch X, watch Threads, you will see dozens and dozens of examples. And thank God we have cell phones now of people being recorded refusing to identify themselves. This is and she's acting so disingenuous. Oh, well, it sounds like you. This is the first I've heard of this. No, It isn't. Oh.
See, this is Bondi not being aggressive. This is Bondi being conciliatory. Like, well, we can work together. I mean, they're doing it to protect themselves, Senator Peters. But sure, if you have some cases, I haven't heard it, but we can talk about it. Disingenuous. It's phony. But she's being the good girl, right? She's being like reasonable and strong and reasonable. Of course we can work together on this fascism that we've been enacting.
Well, Harry, she's shocked to learn that gambling's going on at Rick's Casino. I mean, she had no idea. Oh, Miss Bondi, your winnings. Remember that scene from Casablanca? If you don't, folks, go back and watch the movie.
And also the Music Man. There's gambling right here in River City. I think we have to award Pam Bondi the Flying Fickle Finger of Fate Award.
And now it's time to give the Flying Fickle Finger of Fate Award.
Yes, we do. I'd like to tell her where to put it. I edited that down, folks. I hope you heard that delay. This wasn't the first thing I was going to say. The other thing that I just find so objectionable, right, is this false narrative like, well, they have to cover their faces, Harry, because they're being threatened, their families are being threatened, they're being doxxed. Oh, I mean, these poor ICE agents, Harry, what they've had to go through, my God, I mean, they are really a persecuted minority. I mean, fuck that. That is bullshit. They are bullies. This is a police state. These are secret police. No one's doxing them or harassing them. Show me one example. I have yet to see one example of any ICE agent being personally harassed.
How would anyone know who they were? I mean, the whole thing is insane.
Of course it is. But I really think we shouldn't normalize this idea of masked men, right? It's craziness. It really is a secret police.
It is. And listen, on this show and other commentators, we're watching. And we're going to keep reporting on it.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that later. I think we really, in future shows, have to really get into the depths and the minutia of what is really happening on the streets of America. M. Gesson has talked about, we are a police state. It's now. It's not hypothetical. It's not down the road. It's now. Well, today we have a very special guest. Actually, the truth is we weren't able to get the guest that we wanted for this week. So we're going to do something we did once before when we were in that situation, which is that Harry interviewed me as the guest. So now we're going to turn the tables and I'll be interviewing Dr. Harry Seagull.
I'll be right there. Hold on. There. Now I'm in the guest spot.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Seagull. We're very happy to have you. Thank you for
great
coming.
Show you have, man. I watch it every week.
Oh, you watch it every week?
I haven't missed a single show.
Wow, you're a super fan.
I particularly like your co-host. I think he's very funny and smart.
You left that handsome.
It's very handsome.
Well, actually, I didn't look at your CV before this, but I can tell people that you're a professor of psychology at Cornell University, and until recently also had a joint appointment at the medical school, and that's a story we're not going to tell. But actually, you're going to be retiring from Cornell soon. You also have a private practice, and a number of publications. And actually, I will say this, you are really someone who has launched 1,000 careers in psychology. You're the one clinical psychologist on the faculty at Cornell, which is mostly, like most universities, an experimental or behavioral program. That usually in most universities nowadays, there aren't a lot of clinical psychologists in the undergraduate faculty. So the ones that are there end up inheriting all of the clinical students and being the one to write all the letters of recommendation, to set them up on internships and whatnot. And you've really done that it really has been hundreds and hundreds of students. So I think it is fair to say that you've really launched hundreds of psychological careers.
Oh, that's nice of you to say. I used to run a field placement course where students would do therapy with children in the public schools. And I did it for so many years that I think it was last year, 2 different former students contacted me to say that they'd begun their internship in graduate school and that their new supervisor had also been a student of mine in the same course some years earlier. I do need to correct you a little bit. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology, not tenured faculty. And I should be. I may be retiring in the next year. We'll see. Looks like it.
So actually, how did you get into the field? How did you get into graduate school?
That's a great question. In fact, you know something about it. John keeps mentioning that I have a PhD in English literature, and I do. I was an undergraduate at Columbia, where I majored in English, and but the English department at Columbia was very psychoanalytic. We read Shakespeare, we read Henry James, and I ended up going to Yale in their PhD program in the early 80s, a long time ago. because I was really working on a model of the creative process that I was deriving from looking at literary texts and being able to talk about what I thought was the ways in which the author's unconscious was being expressed through differences in the forms and narratives and repetitive characters in literary texts. And it was my second year there that I began to miss the fact that I wasn't doing a clinical psych PhD, in part because my best friend over here had begun a program, I think at NYU, and I had this pang, like, this is something that I should be doing. He eventually transferred to Massachusetts, and I told him in my second year that I really wanted to get a second PhD after I finished the one I was in. And he looked at me and said, "You're insane." And I said, "I know." I said, "But I really want to do it." He said, "Well, if you really want to do it." And one thing you may not know about John is that he is an expert on systems. He can crack any system. So he looked at me and he said, "Well, okay, if you really want to do this, we're talking about a 4-year plan." So this was 1982. He said, "You're going to be applying in 1985 to get into 1986 program." So he said, "Let me think about it. You don't have a psych major. You have no publications. You've done no research." I said, "Okay, well, you need to present a paper at a conference." I said, "I do?" He said, yeah, you're writing papers on the psychology of literature, right?" So he came down to visit me with Xeroxes from this big catalog of the American Psychological Association. And John discovered that there was a little known division of the American Psychological Association called Psychology and Art. He said, "Here's what you do." He said, "You can't chair a committee. You're not a member of the APA. But if you get someone else to put together a committee to present papers at the conference, you can put yourself on it." I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" He said, "Look, here's all the people who presented last year. Call them up. Tell them you want to put together a panel on the psychology of literature. Tell them you'll do all the work. There'll be a dummy chairman, and put yourself on the panel." So in 1983, I went out to Anaheim, California to give my first paper in psychology at the American Psychological Association. And John joined me, and we actually saw Johnny Carson, the Johnny Carson show, which is one of the great moments of my life, I have to say. He was terrific. Because I gave a paper at a conference, John said, "Well, you're not a psych major." He said, "So you need to spend all summer memorizing 3 textbooks to get a high score on the psych GREs." I memorized 3 textbooks. I got a 96 percentile score. And then he said, "You better get a clinical job." So as a grad student in English at Yale, I got a job at the Yale Psychiatric Institute working with young schizophrenic patients. And I got into grad school in 1985 and went to the University of Michigan in 1986. And I went there having written 1 chapter of my English dissertation, which was on Mark Twain and looking at something I called psychoformalism at the time. I have 1 article I published on it. And John said, "When you get to Michigan, Harry," he said, "I want you to find a really nice, warm, hypomanic junior faculty member who's determined to publish as much as possible. Join him or her and get out of there as fast as you can." So I found Drew Weston, who had already published
We've had on the show.
We've had on the show who had already written a book on political theory his second year at Michigan. And he finished in 4 years, and I finished in 4 years after him. And so that's how I got into the field. And I had great training at Michigan. And I have to say, John was 3 years ahead of me and ended up as a postdoc at Cornell, Westchester, White Plains, where he studied with Otto Kernberg. And he was always my mentor, my role model, because he was a superb young psychotherapist. He really was. And very subtle. So that's my story, how I got here, sort of.
Yeah. Now, you've often given me credit for helping you to get into graduate school. I think we called the technique at the time the sleaze technique.
Sleaze factor.
Oh, the sleaze factor. Okay. But I have to say, that was 40 years ago, and you have perfected it because you, as I say, you have gotten scores and scores of students into graduate school using similarly manipulative methods.
Well, not as ingenious as yours, because really I had no credentials.
Mm-hmm.
I had none. I mean, I was a doctoral student, but I wasn't a doctoral student in psychology. And you helped me to create a CV that made it possible for me to get into grad school. And folks, you have to understand this. I got rejected from 80% of the programs I applied to because they said, you're not a psych major and you had no research experience. But I got into the 2 top programs I applied to because they were more psychoanalytic, which doesn't really exist anymore in clinical psych. So it was the right moment and the right advice.
Good. Well, I'm glad. Another fine mess I got you into. But so one of the questions I think people ask is, well, how are we coping personally? Right, with what's going on. You talk about it every week, but maybe there's a chance to create some space to talk more about that.
So it's a good question, and I do talk about it, and I think, maybe I can end with that general advice after I answer your question more personally, which is, I was born in 1956. It was a decade and a half after the end of World War II. When I was 7 or 8 years old, my parents sat me down, and many Jewish families had this book. And it was a big book about the Holocaust with photographs of the camps, of the death camps. It was the first time I was told about the Nazis and 6 million Jews and 12 million Russians and what the Nazis represented. And to me, it was horrifying. And it made me think of myself as a Jewish boy. And my parents were not religious. We didn't observe anything. We never went to temple. I've never bar mitzvahed, but they were proud of being Jewish nonetheless. And I felt the burden of history. And then when I was a bit older and I learned about the 1930s and fascism and the Soviet Union was still terribly present when I was growing up in the Cold War. But the lesson of fascism, the fall of Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and the values of a democratic society, which I really relied on. Like I relied on it. Yeah. And I have to admit to the audience, I'm not admit, but a peculiar thing about me psychologically is, and it may have to do with coming from a family where things were always kind of turbulent, which was I always believed things would stay the same. Like stay the same. I remember being shocked when CDs came out and I no longer had like phonograph records. I know they've come back, but I remember being shocked when there's no longer 3 television networks, but cable, and I always assumed that our democratic free society would continue. I just thought it would always continue. Even though I took history courses in college, I remember being in a course, Political Order and Change. I was at the University of Chicago for 2 years as a freshman and sophomore. Where I remember someone saying, our system's going to end sometime. All systems do. I remember thinking, oh, I guess that's right. But I never thought it would happen in my lifetime. Or to watch it at least be in danger of ending. And so to me, it has a certain shock. And everyone I know has something that shocks them this way. I mean, I worry about climate change. I think we're destroying the planet, but I have friends who really suffer over it every single day. Like that's what's in their mind. For me, it's the encroachment of political power by someone I think is psychologically disturbed, which is our current president. And every week I say, be vigilant, pay attention, talk to your friends, do something active each week. For me, it's doing this show with John. But I also think, I have a daughter I just love who's 30 and very funny and interesting. A woman's come back in my life who I was apart from for a few years, who I'm deeply in love with. I have dear friends, dear friend John, Jay and his wife, dear friend John, of course, and his wife Nancy, and other friends, John Scrovan and others who I really value those friendships even more, partly because I'm getting older and partly because I feel that things are at risk. Mm-hmm. And it makes me more grateful, not just for being alive, but for living in a society where I can, at least so far, do a show like this without fear of punishment.
Harry, it's funny you mention our our age. We're part of the same cohort, and I think it's really important to give that context. When you and I were young, right, the people rebelling against the sort of fascistic Nixon regime and the Vietnam War were the young people. The people our age. I mean, I remember walking around Central Park with a clipboard trying to get signatures on the moratorium against the Vietnam War when I was 14 years old. But at the same time, having been raised in that generation, we are a generation that has taken the basic American democracy and freedoms for granted. We sort of felt like they were, this was settled law, right? That we couldn't imagine, maybe in a theoretical way, but certainly not in our lifetime, seeing all of those democratic institutions threatened. And what I think is so interesting is now in this current resistance, it's really disproportionately people our age. It's like, it reminds me of that joke about when we were kids, we had to hide our pot smoking from our parents. Now that we're parents, we had to hide our pot smoking from our kids. It's like we keep being on both sides of the generational divide. Now we were rebels when we were teenagers, against the government. And now here we are, old people, and we're in the vanguard, not us personally, but our generation of fighting the authoritarian right-wing Republican regime. So it's really kind of an interesting, sandwich generation, or how to describe our generation, but we've kind of picked it up on both ends.
Well, we're old enough to really remember what it was like to live in a society where there were norms, where when Nixon was caught doing illegal things, the Republicans opposed him. Yeah. And it wasn't partisan. It was kind of great. And we took it for granted, I think.
Ironically, the truism was that the Nixon administration had been the stress test for democracy, right? Because here was a president who broke the law. And as you say, the Republicans and the Democrats joined together. You and I are old enough to remember the Watergate hearings, which went on for weeks and weeks of live television. I just remember watching them day after day after day. And you couldn't tell from the hearings who was a Democrat and who was a Republican. You got the feeling they all wanted to get to the truth, period. The chips fly where they may. And that was what was so reassuring. And then when Nixon fired the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, right, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that he had to hand over the tapes. So the Supreme Court was 9-0. The Democrats and Republicans were united in Congress. In other words, that we would not allow a lawless president. And actually, when you think about what Nixon did, is actually very mild compared to what Trump has done. There was the Watergate break-in, and it was which he was behind, which they were investigating. And the phone call, the smoking gun is on the tape where Haldeman is saying, well, I'm going to have to talk to the guy at the FBI. Maybe we can see what we can do. And Nixon goes, yeah, do that.
Go ahead and do it.
Talk to him. Yeah.
Do it.
And that was the damning thing that got him, they threatened to impeach him. And so he resigned. Now, we realized how naive we were to think that was the stress test, that democracy was strong. Now nothing, we passed the difficult moment. And so it is, I think you're right. People of our generation have the norms internalized. We have a lifetime of norms. We have a half a century of democratic norms internalized in our DNA. I think for a lot of the younger people, they're more confused. A lot of people have really only been around conscious of politics since the Trump era. So what is truth? What is not truth? What is legal? What is not legal? What is constitutional? It's all a big soup, I think. But if you haven't had a lifetime of having these norms internalized.
You're right. This is a moment when the older generation can help educate the younger generation to be subversive, to be oppositional. Whereas in our when we were young, we were doing that for our parents' generation.
That's right.
John, this is that point in the interview where your co-host asks a kind of warm and psychological question as a way of sort of bringing the interview together. Don't you think?
Yeah, he's very good at that, isn't he?
Well, do you want to ask me one more off-topic question?
Well, Harry, I've heard it said that when you were a teenager, you used to record the Johnny Carson show, and then you would actually act it out as if you were Johnny Carson. And I just, I'm not going to ask you if it's true because I know it's true. But my question is, do you feel like becoming the co-host of Shrinking Trump? Do you feel like that's finally brought that latent part of you to fruition?
Well, Ed.
Yeah, right.
We were it was such a wonderful thing to watch Johnny Carson in 1970 when he was at the top of his game. He got so good that he would deliberately write terrible jokes and then just get laughs out of reacting to it. You remember? And if he hit 3 bad jokes in a row, the band would start to play T for Two, and he'd start to tap dance. Well, I guess I since John is reminding me of the story of this time, I guess I'll have to tell you a story about my father, which I think our audience might appreciate. And John, I think you were there for this story. So this was 1974, I guess, my senior year of high school. And my parents were very progressive and lax. And my father, who would come home after working at Citibank, and he would then take everything out of the refrigerator and eat it over the sink. He would just eat whatever was there. And he came home, it was a Friday night, and I had friends over in my room, and we're kind of hanging out. And I said to my father, "Don't eat the brownies that are in the freezer. Do not eat the brownies that are in the freezer." And my father, who had tried smoking marijuana numerous times, had decided that it was all a placebo and it was all in everybody's head, and that it really didn't matter. So, but I said to him, and there were a whole bunch of them, and they were very strong. So, John, I think you were there with me. I know my friend Jay was. You were there. So we're hanging out in my room. It's late. We're watching television. There's music, whatever. And the door of my room swings open. And there is my father standing there, naked, dripping wet. And he says, "Harry!" We all freeze. I go, "Yeah?" "It works." And he turned around and walked back down. He had eaten all of them, and he had gotten in the bathtub, and the room, he said, went like this. So that's my father's THC trip.
That's been a tagline that we've used for now 50 years. But it's still true, folks. Don't eat the brownies in the freezer. That's the message. That's the message that we want you to get from this. Well, thank you for coming on, Harry. We appreciate your time and your perspective. and that you made time to come on the show. And we're really, really grateful to hear that you've been watching every episode.
Well, I really appreciate it. I'm sorry that your co-host wasn't here today. That's the one who's funnier and more handsome than you. But, thanks for having me on. I'll see you in a little bit.
Bye-bye.
Hey, loved your guest. Man, you should have more people like him on the show.
Yeah, and he came from a long way, too, so we really appreciate the trouble he went through to get here.
Well, John, what time is it?
Yeah, I think it's time for shrink wrap again. What have we learned today, other than the fact that your dad ate pot brownies in the freezer?
Don't eat the brownies in the freezer.
Don't eat the brownies in the freezer. That's what we learned today.
The one thing I'll just add to, because I talked about some of this, of course, in the interview a few minutes ago, but things have ratcheted up with the bombing of those facilities in Iran, and even though I never wanted Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and that for that reason I'm very glad it happened. I don't trust the guy in charge. I just don't. And we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how impulsive he'll be. So it's raised my anxiety this week. On the other hand, we have to keep paying attention, listening, and enjoying life. We just have to.
Well, I agree with you. I think things have taken a turn, one that I had predicted, but that really brings things up to a higher kind of DEFCON level. We know that he's trying to destroy democracy. We know that he's a Putin puppet. We know that he's, part of the vast right-wing conspiracy. We know all these terrible things. We know we're becoming a police state and they're trying to destroy the Constitution. But now we also have to worry about world peace and world war. That it's not just a rhetorical kind of hysterical thing to say, oh my God, he's a loose finger on the button, or, he's a loose cannon, or, he could impulsively do something that could tip the world into total war. He can. I mean, we're 5 months in, right? And so I think we have to let go of the comforting fantasy that he doesn't want to make his base unpopular, so he'll never do anything that could plunge us into war. I agree with you that he doesn't want to send troops to Iran. He's not going to put boots on the ground, or at least I don't anticipate him doing that. Or if that happened, it would be way, way down the road, perhaps, as things escalate. But when the world is so unstable and dangerous, and there are so many players with serious weapons and bad designs, it really takes an enormous amount of diplomacy and intelligence to keep the peace. Peace is not natural. Peace is unnatural.
Yes.
Okay.
You're absolutely right.
War is the natural state of mankind.
Absolutely.
As far back as history has been recorded, and I'm sure farther back than that, human beings have always been at war. Right. So that's our natural state. And it's taken, one of the things when I quoted myself talking about, he doesn't have the empathy to imagine how his opponent is thinking. That's how we got out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We almost blew up the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
True.
But Kennedy, because he was clever enough to really put himself in the mind of Khrushchev, was able to understand what pressures he was experiencing, right? So Khrushchev, I don't know if people know this story, but the Cuban Missile Crisis was a serious, we were on the brink of nuclear war. The Russians were building out nuclear weapons on Cuba. And just like Israel has said, we are not going to allow Iran to have nuclear weapons on our doorstep, America said, we are not going to allow Russia to have nuclear weapons in Cuba, where we would have about 3 seconds of, warning if they fired them. And they're really basically, it's a knife at our throat. And so said, we are going to attack Cuba if they don't remove those missiles. And Russia made it clear, you attack our missiles, we are going to attack you. And so we really were at the brink. A lot of people don't know this story, but so Khrushchev sent this very, truculent, martial, threatening kind of communique, you touch Cuba, we're going to incinerate you, blah, 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 blah. And then at 3 a.m. Russian time, a somewhat inebriated second communication comes through where it's a little more reasonable and he's kind of offering some off ramps. And what Kennedy decided is he needed to send the first cable to save face, kind of like the way Iran needed to attack our troops, but we didn't escalate because they warned us and we got it. It was the face saving gesture. And Kennedy said, let's just act as if we didn't see the first cable. Let's just respond to the second cable and say, yes, we accept your off ramp. and it worked, but it took an enormous amount of empathy, right? An ability to think through from the opponent's position in a way to make the right move. So that was a case where it took enormous skill to avoid nuclear war.
And John, you're leaving just one little piece out of that story. By the way, the off ramp, I think, it ended up being a naval blockade of Cuba rather than attacking the missiles.
Right.
It was Bobby Kennedy who convinced his brother not to go to war over this. So it took JFK talking to someone. His most trusted advisor was his brother, who I believe is more intelligent actually than JFK. He was smart enough, but and so thank God for him.
And see, we don't have anyone like that in this administration. I wanted to show it. We didn't have time, but someone asked J.D. Vance, well, what advice would you have for the president? Because, well, my advice is he should just listen to his instincts because his instincts are so good, right? That's the kind of advice Trump really needs. He really needs encouragement to listen to his instincts because, he's so so low in self-esteem, so uncertain, so hesitant, so self-critical. No, of course, that's the opposite of what he needs, right? And so the point is there's no one in this administration, right, that's going to say no to him or even try to confront him with reality. So if he were in a JFK Cuban Missile Crisis type of situation, there's not going to be a trusted advisor say, hey, wait a minute, I think there's another way out of this, or what you're about to do could really blow up the world. That person isn't in the room.
Yes. And that's one of the things that worries us all.
Yeah.
Well, behind the scenes of the Trump White House, it turns out that Pete Hegseth is actually in trouble with Donald Trump. Here's a clip from Washington Week where they talk about it among their distinguished panel.
Talk about Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who apparently is not being invited to meetings about the possibility of bombing Iran, which is kind of in the Pentagon's wheelhouse. What's going on? Are we going to see people forced out of this administration in the coming week or two?
I don't know in the coming week or two, but I think one of the issues with Pete Hegseth is actually the parade. Trump was very disappointed with his big 250th anniversary of the Army parade and thought it was a dud. It just didn't go right. Not happy with Pete Hegseth. There's also a lot of other issues at the Pentagon, but that was something that really got him upset.
I want to say right now, you're kidding.
No, but I am absolutely
all
not
the reasons
kidding.
to dump Pete Hegseth.
I am
the parade.
I'm absolutely not kidding. And in terms of
the parade just wasn't kind of more muscular enough.
Crowded? You saw it. I mean, it was
crowded.
It was a fine parade, but the president didn't think so.
Well, so that's why Trump is angry with Pete Hegseth, his Secretary of Defense, former Saturday host of Fox and Friends. That's basically his credentials. Anyway, we happened to get a hold of a recording of a phone call that Trump made to Hegseth last night.
But so in other words, is it true? Is it actually true that of all the things that Hegseth has effed up, including bombing Iran and actually getting the nuclear facilities, the thing he's most upset about is the parade?
So it seems, and listen to the transcript.
We got to hear this.
Yes, sir. I've been waiting for your call.
Well, that's good, Pete. Very good. Always wait for my call. You never know if it'll be your last one.
Sir?
You really dropped the ball on this one.
I know.
What's wrong with your intelligence?
Well, it was just the first...
I mean, how could this happen? To be so out of step?
I know, sir. They should have been in line. I didn't get to them first.
You're the Secretary of War. It's your job to get them in line in perfect formation.
I know. I should have gone there and made sure that they gave the first impression. Man, do I need a drink. Where's Pam Bondi when you need her?
There's nothing you can do about it now.
Sorry, sir, but that's not true. We can send out little Marco to say the DIA report was deep state, like Biden-ish.
Oh, that! Not Iran. I'm not talking about Iran. I'm talking about the parade. How could you let them stroll like that? It made me look weak, Petey. And you know what that means.
Oh, no. What, sir?
You're gonna look weak instead. Someday, soon, when you think you're fine or fooling around with Bondi, I'll fire you by tweet, just like that. Well, I guess he really was upset about the parade.
So, John, before we go, you were really inspired this week by the bombing of Iran, weren't you? And the immense importance to Donald Trump's narcissistic personality disorder.
Yes. I think that this truly energizes the inner Trump. And in fact, I've heard that he was so elated about it that he was singing in the White House about the Iranian bombing.
John, you're not going to sing another song, are you?
No, this is Trump. This isn't me.
What is it?
Well, since you ask, hit it, Rex. Bomb, 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 Iran. Bomb, 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 Iran. Bomb, Iran. Because I can. Makes me feel like a man. Got me rocking and a rolling, dropping my explosives on Iran. Bomb, 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 Iran. Went to a dance, looking for romance. Saw Iran and thought I'd take a chance. Bomb Iran, bomb, 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 bomb Iran. Rocking and a rolling, dropping my explosives on Iran. Bomb, 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 bomb Iran. Bomb, 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 bomb Iran. Bomb, 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 bomb Iran. Take my hand, make me feel like a man. Woo! Rocking and a rolling, dropping my explosives on Iran. Bomb, 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 bomb Iran.
Goodbye, folks. Thanks for being with us. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. He'll be done singing by then.
Rocking and a rolling, dropping my explosives on Iran. Bomb, 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 Iran.